There are things you learn behind a bar that no textbook could ever teach you. How to read a man's mood from the way he grips his glass, when to pour another drink and when to cut someone off. But nothing prepared me for what I witnessed at the Poseidon's Anchor in Biloxi, Mississippi, during the sweltering summer of 2009. A customer walked in one Wednesday afternoon, ordered a bourbon neat, and by the time he finished that drink, he had become someone else entirely. Not metaphorically, not through intoxication. Literally someone else speaking languages he had never learned, knowing things he could not possibly know, and carrying the weight of a presence so ancient and overwhelming that the air itself seemed to crackle with electricity whenever he moved. My name's Jason Fox, and I've been pouring drinks in bars across America for over 2 decades. I've heard thousands of stories, seen countless strange things, witnessed behavior that defied easy explanation. But there are some experiences that burrow into your mind and refuse to leave. This is one of those. Before we continue, I'd like to know, what state are you listening from tonight? Drop your city or state in the comments below. I love knowing these stories reach people all across the country. Maybe some of you have felt what I'm about to describe. That sensation of being in the presence of something that shouldn't exist in our rational world. All right, back to that afternoon in Biloxi. The Poseidon's Anchor sat 3 blocks from the Gulf Coast, a weathered establishment that had survived Hurricane Katrina by sheer stubborn luck and excellent construction. The owner, a Greek immigrant named Stavros, who had returned to Athens years ago, had sold me the place in 2008. The interior still carried echoes of his heritage, murals of ancient Greek ships, faded photographs of the Parthenon, a bronze statue of Poseidon behind the bar that Stavros insisted brought good fortune. I kept all of it. The place had character, history, a soul that newer establishments lacked. Emmett Townsend first walked through my door on June 17th. I remember the date precisely because it was the day before my birthday, and I was working a rare solo shift, giving my staff the afternoon off. Emmett was 38 years old, though he looked older, with deep lines bracketing his mouth and gray threading through his dark hair. He wore faded jeans and a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms marked with old scars, the kind you get from physical labor or accidents you would rather forget. He sat at the bar rather than taking one of the empty tables. That told me something. People who sit at bars want conversation, or at least the possibility of it. Those who take tables want isolation. I was right. After ordering his bourbon, Emmett looked directly at me with unsettling intensity. His eyes were a peculiar shade of gray, almost colorless in the dim afternoon light filtering through the windows. He asked if I believed in gods. Not God, singular. Gods, plural. I have heard stranger opening lines. 20 years behind a bar exposes you to every flavor of human peculiarity. I told him I believed people found meaning in different places, that faith took many forms. A diplomatic answer, the kind that keeps conversations flowing without committing to anything specific. Emmett's laugh was brief and hollow. He said faith was not what he was talking about. He meant actual gods, the old ones, the Greek pantheon, Zeus and Hera and Poseidon and the rest. Beings of immense power that had never actually died or faded, just retreated from a world that stopped believing in them. I nodded, wiped down the section of bar between us, maintained my expression of polite interest. You learn not to challenge customers' beliefs, no matter how unusual they seem. Everyone carries their own cosmology. Then Emmett told me he was hosting one of them. That was the word he used. Hosting. Like Zeus was an uninvited guest who had taken up residence in his head, his body, his very existence, and was slowly consuming everything that made Emmett himself. The way he said it lacked the dramatic flair of someone seeking attention or telling a tall tale. His voice was flat, exhausted, carrying the weight of someone who had stopped fighting against an impossible truth. I have heard many confessions in my years tending bar, and I have developed an instinct for sincerity. Emmett believed every word he was saying. He explained that it started 4 months earlier, February. He had been working as a restoration specialist, helping rebuild historic buildings damaged by Katrina. The project that changed everything was a small private museum on the eastern edge of Biloxi, a collection of Greek antiquities that had been flooded during the hurricane. The owner, an eccentric collector who had passed away 2 years after the storm, had left instructions for the collection to be preserved and eventually opened to the public. Emmett's job was to assess structural damage and oversee repairs to the building itself. He was not supposed to touch the artifacts. That was for specialists with different training. But one afternoon in February, working alone in the museum's main gallery, he noticed something odd about a marble bust positioned near a window. The piece depicted a bearded man with an expression of terrible authority, and according to the placard, it was a Hellenistic representation of Zeus from the 2nd century BCE. The odd thing was that the bust was sweating. In February, in a building with no functioning heat yet, droplets of moisture covered the marble surface, running down the carved beard, dripping onto the wooden pedestal beneath. Emmett approached to investigate, thinking perhaps there was a leak in the ceiling above. But the ceiling was dry. The moisture was coming from the marble itself somehow. He reached out, more curious than cautious, and touched the side of the bust's face. The shock that went through him was not electrical, though that was the closest comparison he could make. It felt like lightning, but slower, thicker, burning through his nervous system in a wave that originated at his fingertips and spread throughout his entire body. He collapsed, seizing, his vision going white, and then splitting into double, triple, infinite versions of reality layered over each other. When he regained consciousness, 17 minutes had passed according to his watch, though it felt like hours. He was lying on the gallery floor, his muscles aching as though he had run a marathon. The bust was completely dry. No moisture remained on its surface. Emmett assumed he had suffered some kind of medical episode. He went to the emergency room, where they ran tests, found nothing alarming, suggested stress and dehydration. He was released with instructions to follow up with his regular doctor. But over the following days, Emmett began experiencing changes he could not explain. He would lose time, periods of minutes or even hours where his memory simply went blank. He would find himself in different locations with no recollection of traveling there. Once he regained awareness standing waist-deep in the Gulf of Mexico at 3 in the morning, his clothes soaked, his throat raw as though he had been shouting. Worse than the blackouts were the moments of doubled consciousness. Emmett described it as having a passenger in his own mind. He would feel thoughts that were not his own, impulses and desires and memories that belonged to someone else. Something else, an entity of vast age and equally vast anger. The presence felt masculine, powerful, accustomed to absolute authority. It regarded the modern world with contempt and growing frustration, as though imprisoned in circumstances it found intolerable. Emmett tried to research what might be happening to him. He read about dissociative disorders, temporal lobe epilepsy, schizophrenia. None of it quite fit. The presence in his mind was too coherent, too consistent. It did not manifest as hallucinations or delusions, but as an actual other awareness sharing his consciousness. He went back to the museum, intending to confront the bust again, to touch it, and see if that would somehow reverse what had happened. But when he arrived, he found the building locked and a notice posted on the door. The museum project had been canceled. The collector's estate had run out of funds. All artifacts were being transferred to a facility in New Orleans for storage. The marble bust of Zeus was gone. As Emmett told me this story, his hands remained steady on his glass, his voice level. But I noticed small tells. The way his left eye twitched slightly every few sentences. How his breathing would occasionally hitch, as though something was constricting his chest. The sense of terrible tension coiled beneath his surface calm. I asked what he planned to do, whether he had considered seeing specialists, psychologists, anyone who might help. Emmett's expression shifted then, became harder, colder. He said he had tried. 3 different therapists, 2 psychiatrists, a neurologist. They all wanted to medicate him, to treat symptoms without understanding the cause. None of them believed what was actually happening. How could they? The rational world had no framework for possession by a Greek god. He took a long drink of his bourbon, draining the glass. Then he said something that made the hair on the back of my neck rise. He told me that Zeus was getting stronger, that the presence was no longer content to be a passenger. It was learning how to take control, to push Emmett aside, and operate his body directly. The blackouts were increasing in frequency and duration. Soon, Emmett feared, he would black out and never come back. Zeus would consume his identity entirely, wearing Emmett's body like a coat while the man himself dissolved into nothing. I asked why Zeus would want to do that. If a god needed a mortal body, if that was even possible, why Emmett specifically? He did not know. The presence did not communicate in words, only in feelings and fragmented images. But Emmett had formed a theory. He believed Zeus was trapped, weakened, perhaps bound somehow within that marble bust. The storm damage, the flooding, something about the circumstances had created an opportunity. When Emmett touched the sculpture, the entity seized that chance to transfer itself, to anchor into a living vessel. As for why Emmett specifically, it might have been nothing more than terrible luck. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong choice to satisfy his curiosity. I refilled his glass without being asked. On the house. Emmett noticed the gesture, gave me a small nod of acknowledgement. Then he asked if I thought he was insane. I told him the truth. I said I had no idea what he was experiencing, but I believed he was experiencing something. Whether it was neurological, psychological, or something else entirely, the terror in his eyes was real. That much I could verify. Emmett seemed to relax slightly, some of the tension bleeding from his shoulders. He said most people looked at him like he was broken, dangerous, delusional. It felt good to talk to someone who at least listened without immediate judgment. We talked for another hour. He told me about his life before the museum job, his childhood in Jackson, Mississippi, 10 years working in construction, a marriage that ended badly 5 years ago, no children, parents both deceased, a sister in Tennessee he had not spoken to in 3 years after an argument he could no longer remember the details of, a life that was ordinary, unremarkable, suddenly invaded by the impossible. When Emmett finally left that day, the sun was setting, painting the sky outside my windows in shades of orange and purple. He thanked me for listening, paid for his drinks despite my attempt to comp them all, and walked out into the Gulf Coast evening. I assumed I would never see him again. Biloxi was not a large city, but it was large enough for paths to never cross twice by accident. I was wrong. Emmett returned 4 days later. The change in him was immediately visible. He moved differently, with a kind of liquid grace that seemed foreign to his body, as though he was still learning how all the joints and muscles worked. When he sat at the bar, he did not order a drink immediately. Instead, he stared at the bronze statue of Poseidon behind me with an expression I could not quite read. Amusement? Disdain? Something else entirely? When he finally spoke, his voice sounded subtly different. The accent was the same, but the cadence was off, the rhythm of speech slightly formal, almost archaic. He ordered wine. Red, the most expensive vintage I had available. I poured it, set the glass before him, waited. Something felt wrong. The air around Emmett seemed different, heavier, charged with potential energy like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. He took a sip of wine, made a face of profound disappointment, and said the vineyards of the modern world produced only weak imitations of what once existed, that the wine of ancient Thrace could make gods weep with pleasure, while this was barely fit for peasants. The way he said it lacked Emmett's exhausted sincerity. This was not a man describing symptoms. This was someone critiquing wine from personal ancient experience. I asked if Emmett was still in there. The entity wearing his face smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. It carried the coldness of mountain peaks and winter storms, authority that had never been questioned and would tolerate no challenge. He said Emmett was present, watching, screaming soundlessly in the prison of his own skull. But control now belonged to another, to one who had ruled Olympus, who had cast down titans and punished mortals for hubris, who would not remain trapped in this diminished age. The entity drank more wine, still grimacing at its inferior quality. Then it stood, moved to the jukebox in the corner, studied the selection of songs with confusion and growing irritation. It pressed buttons randomly, producing a country music song that seemed to offend it deeply. The entity returned to the bar, sat down and told me that the modern world was a pale shadow, barely worth inhabiting. I asked what it intended to do, if it planned to stay in Emmett's body permanently. The entity's smile widened. It said this body was merely temporary, a vessel to accomplish certain tasks. Once those were complete, it would find better accommodations. Someone younger, stronger, more worthy of housing divine consciousness. I felt a surge of anger then, surprising in its intensity. I have seen many kinds of cruelty in my years behind bars, but something about this entity's casual dismissal of Emmett's existence, its treatment of a human life as disposable, struck me as fundamentally wrong. I told the entity that Emmett was a person, not a possession, that whatever it was, God or delusion or something in between, it had no right to steal someone's life. The entity regarded me with those colorless gray eyes, now holding flickers of something else, a light that seemed to come from within. It said that gods took what they wished, that mortal lives were brief sparks, meaningless in the vast scale of eternity, that I should feel honored to be in the presence of divinity rather than question it. Then, abruptly, the change reversed. Emmett's expression shifted, the terrible authority draining away, replaced by confusion and horror. He looked down at his hands, at the wine glass, at me. He asked what had happened, how long he had been gone. I told him. Approximately 15 minutes. The entity calling itself ZEUS had taken control, spoken through him, described its intentions. Emmett's face went pale. He said it was happening more frequently now, multiple times per day. Sometimes he would retain fragments of memory from the possession, watching helplessly as the entity used his voice, his hands, his body for purposes he did not understand. Other times, like now, he would simply wake up in a different place with time missing and a lingering taste of something ancient and angry in the back of his consciousness. He asked if I had any alcohol stronger than wine. I poured him a double shot of whiskey. He drank it in one motion, set the glass down with trembling hands. Then Emmett told me about the tasks. During the possessions, ZEUS was searching for something. Emmett did not know exactly what, but it involved other Greek artifacts, objects of power that the entity needed to fully manifest, to break free of the limitations imposed by inhabiting a mortal form. ZEUS had been directing Emmett's body to various locations around Biloxi and the surrounding Gulf Coast. Museums, private collections, antique shops, even some people's homes. The entity seemed to have knowledge of where ancient Greek objects might be found, as though it could sense their presence. Emmett feared what would happen when ZEUS found what it was seeking. Would the god discard him then, leaving his mind shattered? Or would it accomplish some larger goal that would have consequences beyond one man's suffering? I did not have answers, but I told Emmett he was welcome to come here whenever he needed, that the Poseidon's Anchor could be a refuge of sorts, a place where someone would witness what was happening to him, remember him as he actually was rather than what was consuming him. He thanked me, his voice thick. Then he asked a strange question. He wanted to know if I had ever felt the presence of something greater than myself, something beyond normal human experience. I thought about it. I told him that sometimes late at night when the bar was empty and I was cleaning up, I felt a kind of thickness to the silence, a sense that the space held memories and echoes of all the people who had passed through, all the conversations and confessions and moments of joy or despair that these walls had absorbed. Whether that qualified as supernatural or was simply how buildings feel after years of human activity, I could not say. Emmett nodded slowly. He said that was close to what he experienced, except the presence in his case was not an accumulation of passive memory. It was active, intentional, hungry. Over the following weeks, Emmett became a regular at the Poseidon's Anchor. Some days he would arrive as himself, coherent and terrified, documenting his experiences in a small notebook he kept in his pocket. Other days, the entity would walk in wearing his body, moving with that unnatural grace, speaking in that formal cadence. I began to notice patterns. ZEUS seemed stronger during storms. When thunder rolled across the gulf and lightning split the sky, the entity would maintain control for hours at a time, often visiting the bar to monologue about the glories of ancient Greece, the weakness of modern humanity, the indignity of being forgotten by the very mortals who once cowered at the mention of its name. During one particularly violent thunderstorm in early July, ZEUS arrived at the Poseidon's Anchor and performed what I can only describe as a demonstration. The bar was nearly empty, just two other customers nursing beers at a corner table. ZEUS approached them, looked them directly in the eyes, and spoke a single word in ancient Greek. Both men stood immediately, moved to the center of the room, and began fighting each other with vicious intensity. No hesitation, no build-up, just instant violence. I vaulted over the bar, shouting for them to stop, trying to pull them apart. They were stronger than they should have been, moved with coordination that suggested training neither of them possessed in normal life. ZEUS watched the violence with satisfaction, making no move to intervene. After nearly a minute of chaos, the entity spoke another word in that ancient language. Both men stopped instantly, blinking in confusion, looking at their bloodied knuckles and torn clothing with no memory of what they had just done. The entity turned to me, smiled, and said this was a fraction of its power, a minor compulsion, the kind of miracle that ancient priests used to convince mortals of divine favor. When ZEUS found the objects it sought when it fully manifested, it would have power to reshape reality itself, to remind the world why humanity once built temples and offered sacrifices to the Olympians. Then Emmett returned, crashing back into control of his body, stumbling and nearly falling. He looked at the two confused, bleeding customers, at me, and understood immediately what had happened. The horror on his face was absolute. He apologized over and over, insisting he would pay for any damages, any medical bills. I waved him off, focused instead on managing the situation, convincing the two customers they had gotten into a drunken scuffle and should probably head home, offering them free drinks on their next visit. After they left, Emmett sat at the bar and wept, silent tears running down his face, his shoulders shaking. He said he could not continue like this, that ZEUS was using him to hurt people, that it would only get worse. He asked if I thought it would be better to just end things, to remove the vessel before the entity could accomplish its goals. I recognized the question for what it was. A man at the edge, contemplating a permanent solution to an impossible problem. I told him that suicide was not an option I could support, that as long as he was alive, there was possibility for change, for solutions we had not yet considered, that I would help however I could, but he needed to promise he would not give up. Emmett made that promise, though I could see the doubt in his eyes, the exhaustion of fighting a battle that seemed increasingly unwinnable. The breakthrough came unexpectedly, from a source I never anticipated. On July 28th, a woman walked into the Poseidon's Anchor asking specifically for me by name. She introduced herself as Dr. Elena Vassos, an anthropologist specializing in Greek religious practices and their modern manifestations. Dr. Vassos was in her early 50s, with gray hair pulled back in a practical bun and sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. She explained that she had been tracking reports of unusual behavior along the Gulf Coast, cases of people experiencing what they described as divine possession or communion with ancient deities. Most reports were easily dismissed as mental health episodes or drug-related incidents. But one case stood out. A man named Emmett Townsend who had been visiting my bar regularly, sometimes presenting as himself and other times as something else entirely. I asked how she knew about Emmett. She explained that one of the customers from the night of the forced fight had posted about the incident on social media, describing it in supernatural terms. Dr. Vassos monitored such posts as part of her research. The details had been compelling enough to warrant investigation. I considered denying knowledge, protecting Emmett's privacy, but something about Dr. Vassos inspired trust. Her approach was academic rather than sensational, curious rather than exploitative. I told her that Emmett did indeed come to the bar, and that his situation was unlike anything I had encountered in 2 decades behind bars. Dr. Vassos asked if I could arrange a meeting. She wanted to observe Emmett, possibly during one of the possessions, to document the phenomenon and potentially identify solutions. When I contacted Emmett, he was initially resistant. He feared being treated as a research subject, an interesting case study rather than a human being in crisis. But after I described Dr. Vassos's credentials and approach, he agreed to meet with her at the bar the following evening. That meeting changed the trajectory of everything that followed. Dr. Vassos arrived early, setting up recording equipment with my permission. Emmett showed up 15 minutes later, visibly nervous. For the first hour, they simply talked. Dr. Vassos asked detailed questions about the initial encounter with the marble bust, the progression of symptoms, the nature of the entity's communications. Emmett answered honestly, describing experiences he had told no one else, not even me. The nightmares where he walked through ancient Greece, seeing temples and cities as they existed 2,000 years ago. the way Zeus would sometimes allow him to observe during possessions, forcing him to watch as the entity manipulated others or searched for artifacts. The growing certainty that his time was running out, that soon there would be no more Emmett, only Zeus wearing his skin. Dr. Vassos listened without judgment, taking notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. Then she explained her theory. She did not believe Emmett was possessed by the actual Zeus, not in the literal sense of the mythological god somehow surviving millennia to inhabit a human body. Instead, she theorized he was experiencing a form of externally induced dissociative identity disorder, created by contact with an object that had been invested with tremendous belief and psychic energy over centuries. The marble bust, she explained, had probably been used in religious ceremonies, venerated by countless believers who projected their faith and fear and worship into the stone. That accumulated energy, that condensed belief, could potentially imprint onto a susceptible individual, creating an alternate personality that genuinely believed itself to be Zeus and possessed fragments of knowledge and power drawn from the collective unconscious of ancient Greek culture. It was a psychological explanation for a supernatural phenomenon, a way to rationalize the impossible within frameworks of science and reason. Emmett listened, his expression unreadable. Then he asked the crucial question. If Dr. Vassos's theory was correct, could the condition be reversed? Could the Zeus personality be removed or integrated without destroying Emmett in the process? Dr. Vassos admitted she did not know. This would be unprecedented, but she proposed attempting a form of ritual therapy, using elements from ancient Greek religious practice combined with modern psychological techniques. The goal would be to confront the Zeus personality directly, to establish boundaries, potentially to negotiate a coexistence that did not require Emmett's obliteration. It was experimental, unproven, possibly dangerous, but it represented hope, an alternative to simply waiting for Zeus to win by attrition. Emmett agreed immediately. We scheduled the ritual for 3 days later, giving Dr. Vassos time to prepare materials and research specific ceremonial elements. She needed space, quiet, and objects that would resonate with ancient Greek religious symbology. I offered the Poseidon's anchor. We could close early, use the space after hours. The bronze statue of Poseidon would provide appropriate atmospheric weight. The night of the ritual arrived. Dr. Vassos transformed the interior of my bar into something resembling an ancient Greek sacred space. White cloth draped across tables, olive branches arranged in clay vessels, oil lamps providing flickering illumination that made shadows dance across walls. She had prepared wine mixed with honey, a libation offering traditionally used in Greek religious ceremonies. Emmett arrived at midnight, accompanied by the sense of barely contained tension I had come to associate with his presence. The Zeus personality was close to the surface, fighting for control. Emmett's eyes kept flickering, the pupils dilating and contracting irregularly. Dr. Vassos positioned Emmett in the center of the space, seated in a chair surrounded by a circle of olive branches. She began the ritual by invoking ancient Greek prayers, calling upon not just Zeus but the entire pantheon, attempting to establish a framework of divine relationships and hierarchies. I watched from behind the bar, aware that my role was simply to witness, to anchor the event in reality through observation. For the first 20 minutes, nothing dramatic occurred. Dr. Vassos continued her invocations, her Greek pronunciation flawless, carrying an authority that suggested years of practice. Emmett sat motionless, his breathing deep and regular, his eyes closed. Then the entity emerged. Emmett's eyes opened, glowing with that internal light I had seen before. His posture changed, becoming impossibly straight, radiating confidence and power. When Zeus spoke through him, the voice resonated, filling the space with authority. The entity demanded to know who dared summon it, who presumed to contain or control a god. Dr. Vassos responded in ancient Greek, her tone respectful but firm, establishing herself not as a supplicant, but as a priestess, someone who understood divine protocols and would not be easily intimidated. The conversation that followed lasted nearly 2 hours. I could only understand fragments as most of it occurred in ancient Greek, but the emotional tenor shifted multiple times. Zeus raged, threatened, attempted to compel Dr. Vassos through sheer force of will. She remained unmoved, continuing to address the entity with formal courtesy, while systematically undermining its claims to absolute authority. She pointed out that Zeus, if truly divine, would not need to hide within a mortal vessel, would not require ancient artifacts to manifest fully. She suggested that perhaps the entity was not Zeus himself, but a fragment, an echo, a psychological construct that believed itself to be a god, but was ultimately a product of human consciousness, rather than a transcendent being. This argument seemed to destabilize the entity. Its confidence wavered. For the first time, I saw uncertainty in those possessed eyes. Dr. Vassos pressed her advantage, speaking directly to Emmett now, calling him by name, reminding him of his identity, his memories, his essential self. She told him that the entity could only control him if he surrendered that control, that ultimately his consciousness existed in his body, his brain, his neural pathways, and no external force could completely override that foundation without his permission. What happened next remains difficult to describe precisely. Emmett began to convulse, his body shaking violently as though two forces were fighting for occupation of the same space. The lights flickered. The oil lamps flared brighter, casting wild shadows. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably, my breath becoming visible in the sudden cold. Dr. Vassos did not stop her invocation, though I could see the strain on her face, the awareness that she was dealing with something that exceeded her theoretical frameworks. Then abruptly, everything went still. Emmett slumped in the chair, unconscious or close to it. The supernatural charge drained from the atmosphere, leaving only a normal August night in a closed bar on the Gulf Coast. Dr. Vassos rushed to check his pulse, his breathing. Both were stable. After several minutes, Emmett stirred, opened his eyes, looked around with an expression of profound confusion and exhaustion. He asked what had happened, how much time had passed, whether the ritual had worked. Dr. Vassos admitted she was not certain, but something had shifted. She could sense it in the quality of Emmett's presence, the absence of that doubled consciousness that had been evident before. Over the following days, the change became more apparent. Emmett experienced no blackouts, no possessions, no sense of an invading entity attempting to seize control. The ZEUS personality seemed to have retreated, though whether it was gone entirely or simply lying dormant remained unclear. Emmett described it as having silence in his mind for the first time in months. The constant background pressure, the sense of another awareness crowding his consciousness, had vanished. He felt like himself again, singular, undivided. Dr. Vassos continued to meet with him regularly, monitoring for any recurrence, providing psychological support as he processed the trauma of his experience. She documented everything, working on what would eventually become a groundbreaking paper about belief-based dissociative phenomena. As for me, I returned to running the Poseidon's Anchor, pouring drinks, listening to stories, maintaining that liminal space where people come to escape or confront their realities. Emmett eventually moved away from Biloxi. The memories were too intense, too intertwined with the city itself. Last I heard, he was living in Colorado, working as a carpenter, rebuilding his life in a place with no connection to ancient Greek artifacts or Gulf Coast storms. But before he left, he came to the bar one final time. He ordered bourbon, neat, just like that first day. We talked about everything that had happened, the impossibility of it, the questions that remained unanswered. I asked if he thought it was really Zeus, or if Dr. Vassos had been right about it being a psychological phenomenon. Emmett considered the question carefully. Then he said that ultimately, it did not matter, whether it was a god or a manifestation of collective belief or a disorder of his own consciousness. The experience had been real. The terror had been real. The sense of something vast and ancient attempting to erase his identity had been real. And surviving it, reclaiming himself, had been real too. He finished his drink, thanked me for everything, for providing a space where he could be witnessed and believed during the darkest period of his life. Then he walked out of the Poseidon's Anchor and into whatever future awaited him. I never saw Emmett Townsend again. But sometimes, during thunderstorms, when lightning fractures the sky above the Gulf Coast and the air crackles with electrical potential, I feel something watching, a presence that lingers in the spaces between moments, ancient and patient, waiting for another opportunity, another vessel, another chance to remind the world what it means to stand in the presence of the divine. I have learned that some things exist in the margins of our rational worldview. Not quite supernatural, not quite psychological, occupying that uncomfortable territory where belief and reality blur together. Gods may not exist in the way ancient peoples imagined, but the power of faith, the energy of worship, the weight of centuries of human consciousness focused on specific entities, these create something. Patterns in the fabric of existence, echoes that refuse to fade. The marble bust that started everything remained in storage in New Orleans for several years. Dr. Vassos attempted to locate it for study, but the facility reported it missing, likely lost during administrative confusion when the collector's estate was finally settled. It could be anywhere now, sitting in someone's home, decorating a garden, waiting in a warehouse for the next auction. And someday someone else might touch it with curiosity and insufficient caution. They might feel that surge of energy, that invasion of consciousness. They might discover what Emmett learned, that the old gods never truly died, they just found different ways to persist. I still run the Poseidon's Anchor. The bronze statue of Poseidon still stands behind my bar, watching over the space with sightless eyes. I have considered removing it, replacing it with something less thematically charged, but doing so feels like surrender, like admitting that these objects have power beyond what we give them. Instead, I keep it there as a reminder that we share this world with forces we do not fully understand, that consciousness and belief in the accumulated weight of history can manifest in ways that defy easy explanation, that a bar can be more than just a place to drink. It can be a sanctuary for those experiencing the inexplicable. Have you ever felt something watching you? Something that cannot be explained by logic or reason? Ever experienced a moment when reality seemed thinner than it should be? When the impossible felt terrifyingly close? Share your story in the comments. I read everyone, and who knows, maybe your experience will be the next I share here. Maybe your encounter with the inexplicable will help someone else feel less alone in their impossible situation. If you want to keep hearing stories like this, real experiences that have crossed my bar over 20 years of listening to the strange and supernatural, subscribe to the channel. New stories arrive regularly, each one carrying its own weight of mystery and truth. The next time you see a Greek statue, an ancient artifact, any object that has survived centuries of human history, remember Emmett Townsend. Remember that some vessels contain more than just artistic beauty. They hold the concentrated faith of generations, the prayers and fears and worship of people long turned to dust. And sometimes, under the right circumstances, with the wrong touch, all that accumulated energy finds a new expression. See you in the next story. If you dare to listen. If you are willing to acknowledge that the world contains more mysteries than our rational minds want to admit. If you understand that sometimes, late at night in a bar on the Gulf Coast, you might encounter something that changes your understanding of what is possible. Until then, be careful what you touch. Be wary of ancient things. And if you ever feel a presence attempting to crowd into your consciousness, to overlay your identity with something vast and inhuman, remember that you are the original inhabitant of your own existence. Your consciousness is sovereign. No entity, no matter how ancient or powerful, can truly take that from you without your surrender. Emmett fought back. He reclaimed himself. If you ever face something similar, remember his example. Remember that survival is possible, even when the impossible becomes terrifyingly real.